If you want to lose all confidence in something that you've done thousands of times before, try filming it for YouTube. What's up, nerds? Javi here from Jetlag Scale Models, and this video was originally going to be how to paint and weather the Edward Zero, but I was having trouble with my paint, specifically the AK 3rd Gen Acrylics, and this got me thinking, is it the paint? Is it me? Is it because I'm filming this video for YouTube that everything that can go wrong will go wrong? And the answer is it was the paint. So in this video, we're going to do a head-to-head paint off between the AK 3rd Gen, AK Real Colors, and the Atom Acrylic by Ammo. Here are our three contenders: the Atom Acrylic IJN Ash Gray, the AK 3rd Gen Acrylic Amber Gray, and the AK Real Colors Amber Gray. All these paints were purchased from Line Art Hobby with my own money, so I still don't know anyone anything. Except you watching, I owe you an honest review based on my own experiences. Let's kick things off with the AK 3rd Gen Acrylics, since these are the paints that gave me the most trouble and shook my model building confidence to the core. If you read the label on the back, it gives you this little spiel how these paints have been formulated to be the best paints ever and make you forsake all other paints, while tasting great with 0 calories. They were thinned down with the AK 3rd Gen thinner because I wanted to play it safe and use the brand recommended thinner, in hopes of reducing any other further issues with the paint. When I was having trouble with my paint, I asked the dudes over at the Scale Model Critique Facebook group for a little advice on using AK 3rd Gen acrylics. The main consensus from those dudes over there was to really thin down your paint, so I thinned the paint down to a 1:1 ratio of paint to thinner. Once the paint was properly mixed, I poured it into the airbrush and sprayed it at 15 psi onto the cube of learning. Even at a 1:1 ratio, the paint was still relatively thick and sputtered out of my airbrush in these tiny little spiderweb patterns. The effect you see on the cube is what was happening on my Zero, and that's just unacceptable. In addition to the sputtering paint, I was also getting tip dry on my needle every 15 seconds or so, which is always annoying to have to stop what you're doing and clean off your airbrush needle. Due to all the sputtering paint and tip dry, I feel like it took me forever to get this small part of the cube painted. Once I was happy with the coverage on that 1/3 of the cube, I moved on to see what fine lines on their own would look like, and it was still terrible. As expected, my attempt to paint fine lines was met with a thick, webby, fuzzy texture, which just didn't work for me. Despite all the shortcomings of this paint, I still wanted to apply it to a small section of the inside of the Zero to get a true comparison of the three paints. So of course, when I sprayed it onto the model, I didn't have any issues at all and it sprayed perfectly. Psych! It still sucked. Also, who still says psych? It seemed like the longer the paint stayed in my airbrush cup, the worse the issues were. Tip dry was occurring with increasing frequency, therefore making the sputtering issues worse. There is one positive thing I can say about this paint, is that even though it shot out of my airbrush a little on the chunky side, it dried and leveled out to a relatively smooth finish. Overall though, the headaches of this paint just aren't worth it to me. But if you can get this paint to work for you, then you must be some sort of space-age paint wizard from another dimension, and I'd like to shake your hand. In talking to a few of these space-age paint wizards, a few of them mentioned that they use a cocktail of thinners, paint retarders, and flow aids to get these paints to work for them. But it's my humble belief that you shouldn't have to be a freaking chemist to get acrylic paints to work. And I can hear you already screaming at your TV again, saying, "Well, you just don't know anything about paint." Well, you're wrong. I was a painting and printmaking major in college, and I'm a high school art teacher by day, so I actually know a thing or two about paint. So while I don't recommend the AK 3rd Gen acrylics for airbrushing, I do think they are fantastic for brush painting. Next up, we have Amber Gray from the AK Real Color Lacquer line. And these paints are currently going through a rebranding, so get these little glass bottles while you can. And I thinned them down with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner because, well, this stuff just works. In a total boneheaded move, I forgot to hit record for this portion of the paint test, but to be honest, it would have made for great content because the AK Real Color sprayed perfectly and I didn't have any issues with them at all. And as far as the fine lines go, just more pure lacquer perfection. Here you can see more lacquery goodness. Crisp fine lines, no spider webbing, 0 tip dry, just the ideal painting experience. One thing to note is that the hue of the AK Real Colors Amber Gray is a little warmer and lighter than the 3rd Gen acrylics. And while I'm not an expert on World War II Japanese paint colors, the Real Colors paint just looks a little more Zero-y to me. I deliberately chose to do this paint test on my model over appreciated black base, sandwich shaded, marble malted, whatever you want to call it, so you can get a better sense of the real application of all these paints. And I have no problem doing it on the inside of my Zero because it really won't be seen. And let's be honest, Once it's done sitting on my display case, the only time it will probably ever get picked up again is if one of my little nephews decides to take it on a kamikaze mission, and hopefully I've trained him better than that. Here you can get a better sense of the hue variation in the two paints. If you're wondering how I'm going to resolve this, the answer is simple. I'm just going to paint over it. Something that one of my painting professors told me many years ago that has always stuck with me is, it's just paint. Don't be afraid to paint over your mistakes. It's a lot easier than starting over again. And while he was talking about works on canvas, I've carried this mentality over with me to my little toy airplanes. And in terms of model building, if you really stop to think about it, the painting process is probably the most forgiving and flexible part of any build. And finally we have the Ammo Acrylics by Ammo, with the Ammo Acrylic thinner. And once again, both these paints were thinned to a 1-to-1 ratio. The more I use these paints, the more I absolutely love them. They spray out of my airbrush thin and silky smooth. I was a long-time acrylic guy before making the switch to lacquers this past summer, but these Ammo Acrylic paints by Ammo will definitely have me switching back. These paints really do have most of the benefits of a lacquer with the slight exception of drying time. I have a pretty bad habit of getting some gnarly thumbprints in my paintwork, and when working with lacquers, after 5 solid minutes of drying, the possibility of thumbprints is greatly reduced. I conducted a thumbprint test with the Ammo Acrylics, smashing my thumb into the paint every 5 minutes. After 30 solid minutes of drying, your paintwork should be mostly fingerprint resistant, barring you don't have Cheeto fingers or a thumb full of Tamiya Extra Thin. When testing out the quality of the fine lines, I learned that a ratio of 1-to-1 paint to thinner might be a little excessive, but I still got a better result than with the AK 3rd Gen. The 1-to-1 ratio is ideal for building up thin layers of paint over large areas, but for finer detailed airbrush painting, I'd probably go with a 2-to-1 mix of paint to thinner. Now for the application on the model. At this point, the paint had been in my airbrush cup for about 30 minutes. In that time, the paint had just slightly thickened up enough for the fine lines for my marble coat to be nice and thin with zero spidering. And at this point in my paint test, the lacquerness of these acrylics was even stronger than ever. It should also be noted that with the Ammo Acrylics, I had zero tip dry the entire time I was painting. If I'm going to be nitpicky, the one issue I have with the Ammo Acrylics really isn't an issue at all, but it's that their IJN Ash Gray is so vastly different from the AK Real Colors Amber Gray. Honestly though, that's to be expected, so it's really nobody's fault but my own. So going back to what I said earlier, it's just paint, and I'll paint over it with the Real Colors Amber Gray. So what did we learn from this little experiment on airbrushing paint? First of all, don't believe everything you read, and advertising is all hype, but you already knew that. Second, I really couldn't get the AK 3rd Gen acrylics to work for me, and I really just don't like them much for airbrushing. Number C, lacquers will always be the supreme airbrush paint. And finally, that the Ammo Acrylics are a pretty solid alternative to lacquers, especially if you don't want to deal with all the solvents and VOCs. Hopefully this video on watching paint dry gave you a little more insight on choosing the paints for your next Japanese Zero build. Also, did you all know that all YouTubers, big or small, are obligated to tell their viewers to like and subscribe? So I would really appreciate it if you click the like and subscribe button with the appropriate amount of force on your device. And thank you so much for watching. You'll see me next time, because YouTube's not a good.